Thank you all for your very, very interesting papers. Have we got a second microphone, actually? Yeah, oh yeah, maybe you should pass it. I guess one of the things, the kind of main things that struck me, which I guess is probably quite obvious in some ways, but that we're talking about kinds of things that were obviously like important to Hepworth in many ways, but haven't, historically had the attention, of course, so that, you guys are all bringing attention to them now and bringing value to them now. And I'm thinking of the fact of, for instance, that with the donation of the records to the Tate Gallery archive, the fact that Hepworth donated her sculpture records, but didn't donate potentially the drawing and painting ones, or, and why that might be in some ways. But then I'm thinking about, the different things, and for instance, the fact that at the Barbara Hepworth Museum, you show that photograph, Claire, where there was the books in the background, and then the decision made when the museum was set up of, potentially we can't really show those, or they might go missing, or that they were a bit blackened on the spine or something like that from the fire, that to remove them. And all of those things, I guess, that now we're kind of bringing, potentially kind of value back, the other spaces like the summer house, the greenhouse, those other sites that maybe haven't had the attention before. But I just wonder if you could maybe also say a little bit about that, about how our attention is now maybe going to other things. Like it brings value and interest and knowledge back to the sculpture, but also it shows maybe the diversity of Hepworth. And I was thinking today actually with Hepworth as chemist that we had earlier, and Hepworth as engineer, and like all of these things that she is and she does. And this, again, all of your papers, I think, showed these other parts of her work and her personality and her life. And you've got. Yeah.
Shall I go first?
Yeah.
Well, maybe us together, maybe. Because I think, although there are catalogues, a lot of catalogues, and the monograph is carvings and drawings, my sense is that drawing/painting has always been a slightly secondary aspect of her work. So even in the monographs, there are only a few pages, and likewise, she doesn't write quite as much about drawing, the act of drawing, what drawings mean, to the same degree that she does sculpture. And yet, I think they are very much a sculptor's drawings. They are, especially these from '57, they're incredibly physical. And I would argue, potentially, that only a sculptor could have made them in terms of their sort of gestural quality and the sort of dance-like quality that she gets via the Zen books. So I think they deserve it, and they are more diverse. And I think drawing and painting comes in fits and bursts. There are periods where she concentrates on that activity, and I think it is more than just it's more than just thinking about form or problem solving. I think it is a worthy area in its own right.
I would agree with that, and it's exactly what you just said, that it sort of lacks the continuity that her sculptural practice would have had, I think, and in that's why we consider them as well sculptors' paintings rather than considering them how you would consider a painter's paintings. It's sort of a different category, and you said, that they were slightly secondary. They were definitely secondary to her, tangential. But equally, when she was working on them, I think she was dedicated to each individual work. It wasn't, this is gonna feed into the sculptural practice. It certainly did, but it wasn't necessarily for the sculpture. I don't think. Yeah. So.
I just wonder also on that note about painting, you guys will know better, but whether there is also that thing, you often get painters and I'm just thinking of Picasso or Matisse, you look at their sculpture, painter who's a sculpture, but you don't ever seem to get it so much the other way around, looking at a sculptor's paintings in the same way. And I just don't know what there is about that.
And if I could just add, certainly when we're working in their garden and we do all of our maintenance when the public are there, that they are hugely fascinated in everything about Hepworth. So, oh, is that Hepworth's chair? What make is that? Oh, I'm going to look on eBay and see if I can find one. Oh, she's got good taste. Oh, what did she use the summer house for? What did she do in there? Did she draw in there? Did she make in there? What was that? So almost everything is just such a huge interest to everything. So the social history is hugely fascinating to the public, as well as, you know, the amazing art.
I think just going to say that also the different ways she used the different spaces, like for example the greenhouse at the top, which she said she had books. She said she hadn't got any tools in them, but she said she had books and maybe drew in them and maybe did some writing at there. So actually kind of thinking about the actual studio itself, but actually sort of more widely what those different spaces represented.
I have a question for Stephen. In terms of the scale of the drawings, I think some are quite big and some are quite small.
Okay.
But the question is about whether it's to do, how much it's to do with measuring her body's limit, but also whether some of them might have been done almost, they look like somatic drawings, or as if they were done blind, as if she closed her eyes and drew them. Would you know much about the process?
I'm getting to grips with it. I would say works on paper are pretty uniform sized. And the image of the British Council drawing, I mean, it's still got the perforations from the sketchbook. Works on board tend to vary. Yeah, but sometimes it's the same. I mean, sometimes it's a landscape format, sometimes it's portrait. My sense of the paintings is that it's a more complicated process. I would say, you know, where she has used oil paint on board, it's a much more complicated process. And I think it varies. Where you have a big sort of splodge of ink at the start of a line, I'm guessing there's quite a lot of distance between her and whatever support that they're on. Sometimes, in order to have got that sort of flexibility in whatever she used, there would have been potentially that they were on the floor, or at least done from a certain height. And this is where the bamboo cane idea came to me with another artist, where we was experimenting with different tools of what she might have used. But also I think there's either she walked round as she did it, or that she would turn the page or the board, because the black ink, where you get a splodge at the top and at the bottom, it's going over the same line. Because obviously if there's anything hollow, you get a big splodge at the beginning, and then it runs out quite quickly. And then there's another big splodge at the end. That means she's redrawing. So I think which is why I think the whole Tashist allusion is more complicated than it seems at first, because they're not as spontaneous as they at first appear. So that's a slightly rambling answer, but I guess each one is slightly different, I think, and there are ones that are more complicated than others. The drawing from Kettle's Yard, I think there's potentially a little bit of monoprint involved in that as well, where there's been some wax resist to get a sort of surface texture, but there's no wax on the paper. So I think there are degrees of involvement, but Jenna will be able to tell us all.
Any other questions?
How, and this is obviously just my interpretation, but someone who draws, there'll be a relationship with rhythm and with sound in the drawings as well, especially in these repeated forms. And I would imagine as someone who draws in a similar way that she would have had her eyes closed in order to do that, just from my personal experience of drawing.
I'm very intrigued why there's so many of the same kind of form, because they, in a sense, don't vary that much, and I'm intrigued by that, but haven't quite got to grips with the why yet.
just have another one, which is just about, I think, it's a point that you made, Stephen, and then I think coming up in Claire's talk, which is about like Hepworth and a kind of intellectualism as well. I think you kind of said, but this kind of idea that, you know, you can't just do something for its own sake. You have to kind of connect it with something, and then seeing how maybe she's doing that in the books. And I wonder whether, Claire, maybe you might be able to say a little bit more, kind of speak to that point a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me what was really fascinating was sort of tracing those different moments in terms of the intellectual world, and where they were fitting in, the patterns and what was being read when, and how that you could really see that coming through the library, and which really gives the kind of argument for a lot of what we were saying. I think also just that what really came over from the library is just how widely she was reading and how important it was, and to have books on all those different subjects. That this was really, you know, she was kind of finding the right people, whether that's like the scientists who know who the most expert, or whether that's musicians who know about, and really kind of tapping into the right people who would know about in their respective areas, I think.
I think that your comment about how books were passed around St Ives. I mean, she writes to Herbert Reed about, you know, he'll have sent her a book, and then she's looking forward to it coming back after it's sort of gone round the sort of circle, and then, you know, finally it's back, and how excited she is to read it again. So.
It's not really a question, because it's an unfair question, but the one thing that struck me when you were going through the books is perhaps a question as to how unusual such an extensive library was. The reason why I'm interested is because the research I'm doing on Roberto Gerard, another composer, his library is exactly the same. He lived in Cambridge, he had the Burnell book, his ideas about form and structure and rethinking what music could be in the 1950s and 60s is often informed by science and other arts. Very much like that. It strikes me as being very different from something like the Britten Peers collection, which has masses of books, but it's mainly scores, poetry, philosophy, and literature.
Right.
There's nothing with the breadth that we find in Gerard or Hepworth's library.
Really fascinating.
So although it's not a question, I would be interested in trying to find out how unusual such a collection was, and how unusual she was in being that interested and that well read in so many diverse subjects.
And I think obviously also kind of books of a certain time. My supervisor, Alison, when she first saw the Hepworth Library, said, these are all the books we had to read at art school. So there was also something of it being of its time, and she sort of recognised that. But that's a really, really interesting point, that similar things coming across.
Just a question for Deborah, which is, I guess, if I don't know if this is some fair question, but whether you could speak a little bit about the restoration of the garden as well, like what's happened in kind of recent years, or if you know much about that. But I guess I'm just thinking about this idea of like the kind of holistic approach that you say to like what's going on at the Barbara Hepworth Museum now in terms of conservation and restoration, and whether, you know, or what plans there are coming up for other areas maybe that are going to be restored, or I don't know if there's anything with that.
I can't really talk about the garden because that's Jodie who does that in collaboration with the teams. But all I can say, he's done an amazing job. He really has a great eye, and the planting is just so complementary to the sculptures now. In the summer when the colours are out, the sculptures just pop. But he is also empathetic towards the conservation that's required. So that when we do have to do a major intervention, we just speak to him and he will lift the plants so we haven't trampled everything. He's also very good at trimming back, so it works for the trees and the shrubs, and also helps prevent the debris coming onto the sculptures, so it helps with our maintenance, etc. So we've actually got a very good collaboration there. And I think, you know, moving forward, as I said, we want to look at some of the paper ephemera now that we've done one of the costumes I would be interested in to see what other textiles there are, to see how we can manage those. And obviously, as Sarah said, you know, the palets coming to the fore now, and the main area that I'm looking at is making sure that the single form floor is managed, maintained, and kept, possibly lifted, etc., while the rest of the work may be moving forward. So there's always something, because she's got such a massive archive. So
Great, yeah. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helena, for chairing so tightly, given our time. And I just want to invite Penelope to come up and give her responses to this jam-packed day.
Yeah, this would be a very challenging thing to do, but I don't know how much appetite there is now for a response. But I have made some notes, so I'll try and be succinct. In terms of, obviously a dominant theme is materials, which runs into surfaces, which runs into colour. And I think that it came over really, for me, more clearly than ever before, not only how careful Hepworth was to get unusual materials and her level of involvement. I think we all knew that she was involved, but I think it came through very clearly how especially involved she was. But also I think what came through today and yesterday was her interest in differentiation or contrast. So, and whether she used paint or used patina to find those contrasts. I think that came through really strongly, for the first time, so strongly. And in terms of resources, I was thinking, Hepworth is so unusual in terms of the wide range of resources that we have available to us. It's not just places, all the different kinds of places that we've seen. It's also the different kinds of archives. It's the different kind of people who've been involved in studying her work. And you know, we've heard 20 different people here in the last day and a half. It's very unusual to have an artist to have that level of concentration. And the records that she kept and which conservators have kept, and the tests which now can be done. So we have a very diverse range of material. I think it's quite special. And that range of voices, I think it could be heard more and used more. Someone, I forget who, talked about the undisturbed evidence in the site. And I think it's maybe interesting to think about the relationship between the undisturbed evidence that we need to identify, but then thinking about the evidence that we need to disturb to get more out of it. And obviously, in thinking about Hepworth in particular, but any single artist, we're always thinking about biography. I think when I began working on Hepworth, I felt that the whole concept of landscape was very old-fashioned and cliched. And I think you brought forward how it doesn't need to be seen in that way, and how it can be actually quite revealing and a way to open up, thinking about the relationship between place and biography. I think we always knew that Hepworth has a great seriousness, a kind of high-mindedness, which I think was probably one of the reasons why she wasn't so popular in her time. And maybe it still is a problem for us, how to communicate that earnestness and seriousness, which we've seen in the library. You know, she didn't want to be an easy artist, I don't think. She wanted to express difficult, complicated ideas. And that's maybe a challenge for us now in terms of how to communicate the seriousness that lies behind her work. It's both, you know, we can think about biography in terms of the conventional approach, but also the unconventional. Maybe we can start to use landscape as a way of allowing us to think about Hepworth as a woman, even if she didn't want herself to be promoted as a woman sculptor and certainly not as a sculptress. In fact, if we give ourselves a little bit more license to use some new thinking, we can understand what is unusual about her and what's different. And I think it was, I forget who it was, someone talked about the relationship between motherhood and tactility. And you know, it's not talked about very much, but if we actually allowed ourselves that license to think about the relationship, we probably would go further into understanding something about why her sculpture is special and different. And I think actually it might be fair to say now that there are more people working on Barbara Hepworth than on Henry Moore. So we're always kind of a little bit embarrassed about comparing Hepworth to Moore and say Moore comes in too often. But in fact, I think there's more interest now. There are more people in this room now who are doing current research on Hepworth than I think we would find on Henry Moore. So, let's not be embarrassed about it. Let's celebrate that diversity of approach. The upcoming projects, I thought people were curiously restrained in talking about their upcoming projects. And I thought Natalie did a good job in describing the upcoming project alongside, but I think we could be more explicit about the nature of that project and what we learn from looking at sculpture by women. It doesn't just need to be a list. We need to think about what it means and what it teaches us. There's no need to hold back, I don't feel. And similarly, we've heard almost nothing about the Hepworth exhibition that's going to be held here next year. And it's a shame that we haven't had time to think about what that might be. And I suppose I feel from the last day and a half we've had one option is to do something that is a standard survey retrospective and do it as well as you possibly could, because some people, especially younger people in this room, feel they've never seen that. And other people would like to see new voices and new responses and new contexts. And I suppose the question for us really is, to what extent do we need to find those new contexts, or is it that are we embarrassed to do a standard retrospective of Barbara Hepworth, or is that boring to us now, and do we need to open up those new contexts and think about her in a new way? I suppose I feel that there's something that is static and unchanging about Hepworth, which for good and for bad. And we do need to think about responses which are changing and allow us to think about changing ways of thinking about her. I think that's always been a dichotomy in Hepworth studies, and that hasn't changed. And I think we need to try and kind of celebrate what is, you might say, eternal in her work, but also think about new ways of interpreting her and allow some of the new ways of thinking about her to emerge and to be present. And in terms of the network, when I arrived yesterday at lunchtime, Michael said, why do we need a network? Everyone knows everyone already. But it's not true. I mean, there's more people in this room that I don't know than I do know. So in a way, it does exist, but I think it needs to be made more visible. I really do feel that the Hepworth here in Wakefield could do something to show that. All these different people with different ways of thinking about Hepworth, their voices could be visible here now, not just in a closed workshop, but in the galleries, different, in modest ways. I think that different researchers' work could already be visible. And then, of course, we need to cultivate a wider network. Simon Wallace talked about the younger generation, but there's plenty of pretty young people in this room, I feel, even if I'm one of the older ones. But obviously his concern is how to make Hepworth interesting to teenagers and to really younger people. And that's something that is going to be a challenge for you in the exhibition, and I guess it is on a daily basis. I still feel a key lacuna in Hepworth is the international context. And we keep looking at her in relation to pretty much English artists and the English art scene. And if there could be a chance to do an exhibition in which there were international counterparts at the same time, I think that would be really great. And to look at her work of all periods in relation to international figures. It's more expensive, of course, to do that, but I think it would be worthwhile because I think she herself reveals that she's always thinking internationally, not just nationally. So, although we're near the end of our revised deadline, you've got 5 minutes to tell us what are the next steps for the network. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Penelope. That's a really fantastic way of summing up what we might have learned from today. Let me see if I can add answer some of the things that you've said. And I think one important thing to say is that part of the idea and indeed the application that we've put into the HRC of the Hepworth Research Network is indeed that some of the research that comes out of this, the new voices, the new context, can be made present in the galleries upstairs. not necessarily in the galleries that we were looking at today, that was supposed to be more of an exercise in kind of display and what it communicates, but thinking about Gallery 3, where we have a kind of permanent Hepworth mini-survey, but that survey has different focuses, and that's where, for example, Roseanne, who presented her work today, that work was displayed in relationship to Hepworth last year. So this is a kind of a thought to continue that, to try and think about different ways that we can recontextualize Hepworth or rethink about Hepworth, and also bring in the younger generation. I will just talk about the network's future events very, very briefly, which is, and then if anyone wants to stay afterwards, I will very happily talk through the plans for the summer show next year. But I know that people have trains to catch, so just to keep within our revised deadline, to say that this is obviously the Hepworth Research Network launch, and we're very grateful to the Art Fund's curatorial network and grant scheme for providing us with the funds to bring this sort of first group of people together. We definitely intend to make the network bigger, and to make it grow, and to make it public in a variety of different ways, not just in the galleries here, but also thinking of an online platform where we can publish some of these short papers if people are interested, and we're sort of talking about whether that's going to be hosted with the University of York or at the Hepworth website at the moment. So I guess watch this space. We're sort of continuing to work on it, and we'll be sending information your way. But the idea is that there'll be 2 other events this year, hopefully one at the University of York and one at the University of Huddersfield in the Barbara Hepworth building. So we will keep the network as a whole informed of those, so that as we begin to make them, and hopefully next time you'll see more people here, and it will keep growing and continuing to cultivate these sort of conversations. So that's it for today. Thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions about any of that before we go? 2 minutes. No? Yes? Yes, it's been filmed, it's been recorded, and again, we are currently working out with our website team here how we make this sort of content available. It's my hope that we basically have a Hepworth Research Network page, and then those of you who wish can write up your papers, and that we can make those available open access on there as well, and that as we have these events we can continue to do this. So that, I think what's really interesting is actually, Helena did a seminar, as someone mentioned, about the Turin studio, how many years ago now? 7 years ago now? And very kindly sent me the notes from that, and it was so interesting, but it's not really publicly easily found. So I guess what I was hoping partly is also that these 10-minute papers might make some of these interesting interdisciplinary conversations a bit more easily accessible for those who want to learn a bit more about Hepworth. And
you can, that is on the website.
yes.
It's a PDF of what you wrote us about the research. So the film has gone, but I'm on to that. The little film that was made. But yeah, so
Yes.
as soon as, even through your website, it's great, because I know other people who really would love to know what's gone on today.
Yeah, and hopefully, as I was sort of saying over tea as well, I know there are other researchers in tangential fields. For example, Alice from Edinburgh was mentioning someone who's a mathematician who's looking into Hepworth. So I think it would be really interesting to expand from the material to the immaterial, as Michael said before, in looking at people from other areas, but also other artists like Roseanne. I think it's a really interesting way to sort of think about some of these material choices through talking to current practicing artists as well. So, anyway, thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate your generosity.